Stuart Fox. I'm a senior lecturer in politics from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. And my research focuses predominantly on the way that young people participate in politics and the way that it's changing over time. But I'm also interested in the capacity of volunteering, whether that's the European Solidarity Corps, Erasmus, or volunteering for a service learning thing in school, or just for a bookshop, a homeless shelter in your local community. Whatever form it takes, I'm interested in the capacity of volunteering to promote solidarity by encouraging political participation. And so I am privileged to have the chance to talk to you about what my research and others has found about the way that volunteering succeeds and fails, where we need to work harder, in promoting solidarity in Europe by helping people participate in politics. So I want to explain first of all why I think political participation is at the heart of this. It's not just because this is the research I do and you should all care. It would help, but that's not what's at the core of it. Political participation refers to just about anything, right? Anything that you do to express your political identity, your values, and to try and influence a political decision. You might vote, you might sign a petition, you might protest against a company that's not reducing carbon emissions. Doesn't matter what it is. If you're trying to influence politics, broadly defined, it's political participation. And political participation is critical to what we understand to be European solidarity and to active citizenship. Active citizenship is at the core of Europe's values, of Europe's understanding of what democracy means. It refers to us taking an active role in the democratic government of our society in a whole host of ways. When we participate in politics, when we vote, when we protest, volunteer, sign a petition, we are exercising both our right and our responsibility to take part in our own government. Political participation and active citizenship are critical to solidarity. There's been an awful lot said by people who are far more informed and possess far greater expertise than I about what solidarity is. So I hope I'm not offending the previous speakers by using this incredibly cumbersome definition of solidarity meaning trying to bring about positive change, right? The best story I can think of. But one of the things that solidarity, as we as a community understand it, imply is action. Okay, we care not just about being a cheerleader for solidarity, saying that we think things should get better. We care about people being agents of solidarity, people trying to do things to bring about that positive change. Political participation is one of the ways we do that. You might vote for a party who's advocating a policy that you believe will bring about positive change. You might protest. You might riot, right? You might disagree about why you do things, what you do, whether it's the right way to do it. But political participation is one of the ways in which we can become agents of solidarity. Therefore, any decline, deterioration, or bias in political participation, or who is participating in politics in any way, is a real problem. It's a challenge, not just for them, not just for European democracy, but for what we all understand to be European solidarity as well. Excuse me. Sorry. Now, my research, as I mentioned, focuses on the political participation of young people. I'm particularly interested in the extent to which young people today are voting, usually in lower numbers, than previous generations of young people. Now, today's young Europeans participate in politics in a really wide variety of ways. It doesn't start and end with voting, and I don't want to demean the activities that people engage in outside the ballot box by implying that it does. It doesn't. Most young people have at least some interest in politics. Most young people are politically active in some way. But young generations today are typically less likely to be interested in politics than previous generations at the same age, and they're less likely to vote. Now, when I talk about young generations, I am referring to what in Britain we seem to now universally call millennials and Gen Z or Gen Z. A millennial is basically someone born between 1980 and roughly the mid-1990s. Contrary to my grey beard and receding hairline, I am a millennial. I was born in 1985, so this makes me one of the older millennials. So it's my generation we're talking about here too. And then Gen Z was everyone born after 1995. This is a group of people whose experience of politics was largely formed in the aftermath of the financial crisis. These are the people who vote in lower numbers today than their parents did and their grandparents did when they were the same age. Even if we take into account all the other things that shape whether or not someone votes, their income, their education, the type of election, you take all of that into account, and your average millennial or Gen Z will vote in lower numbers, or is less likely to vote, than their parents and their grandparents were at the same age. And this is a really big problem. It's not just a problem because the voices and the political priorities of young people matter. It's a problem because voting is habitual. We get into habits that dictate largely whether or not we vote in elections. Not necessarily how we vote, but whether we vote. If you vote in the first election in which you're eligible to do so, after you've turned 18 or 16 in some countries, chances are you'll vote in the next one, and then the next one. And by the fourth or fifth election, it's not really a question of, am I going to vote? It's a question of, how am I going to vote? But conversely, if you don't vote in the first 2 or 3 elections in which you are eligible to do so, a habit of non-voting can just as easily form and persist. So low youth turnout today shapes and leads to lower turnout of middle-aged people later. It's already happened to millennials, it's happening now to Gen Z. The result is persistent generational divides in voter turnout. These dots were all joined originally, I apologise, and for that. So you'll have to use your imagination to fill in the lines. But the dark green squares refer to the millennials. The dark blue squares refer to Gen Z. This is data from the European Social Survey. I've just picked 8 countries. I apologise if yours isn't on there, but I can assure you, unless you live in Belgium, the same thing's happening. What we can see is the green dots and the blue dots are both lower than all the yellow dots, which represent the older generations. In some countries, the generational divide's pretty small. Okay, Germany's all right for this, Spain. In some, like the UK or Ireland, the generational gap is huge. And even as millennials have got older and become more likely to vote, which you can see there with those green dots, they're going up, right? This is the millennials getting older and becoming a bit more likely to vote. There's still a clear gap between them and the older generations. So low youth turnout today means that today's young generations are falling behind their elders, and there's no expectation that they're going to catch up. But this picture is even worse, because low youth turnout is not happening to everyone. It is young people from poorer backgrounds who are by far the least likely to vote. That's what I'm illustrating on this graph. What we've got here is the same data from the same countries, but I've split those generations depending on whether they have a graduate level qualification or a non-graduate qualification. A rough and ready way of drawing a distinction between people who are more likely to come from wealthier households and to earn more money and to have stable jobs when they're older, and people who are less likely to come from such environments. Again, there's variation between the countries. But in all of the countries, you can see it's the non-graduates, it's the young people who are likely to come from poorer backgrounds whose turnout falls behind that of their elders the most. In some, it isn't that bad. I would say in Germany, it's there, but it isn't too bad. But look at Ireland, look at France, look at the UK or Portugal, and it's awful. What these dots are wholly inadequately communicating is that we have a serious problem. We have a problem not just of falling youth turnout, we have a problem of young people from the poorest backgrounds who need to be represented the most falling out of our electoral political debate. That's what these dots really mean. Poor young people being shut out of democracy. And this is really bad. It's not just bad for young people, it's bad for all of us. It's bad for European democracy and it's awful for European solidarity. We obviously end up with young people, and again particularly poor young people, being underrepresented in election results. They don't get the same say as everybody else in picking who forms the next government. They also are less likely to be paid attention to or prioritised by politicians when they make public spending decisions. Now, I will interrupt myself at this point and say I gave a presentation similar to this about a year ago and someone went, it's the politicians' fault. It's not the politicians' fault, or not only their fault. We want politicians to listen to voters. We don't want politicians to have a load of people who are voting for them, holding them to account, caring about their manifesto, and then go, yeah, but stop that. We want to listen to the people who aren't voting, right? You're not going to win any elections that way. No rational politician's going to do that. We want politicians to listen to voters. But the unfortunate consequence of this is they pay less attention to those who don't vote, which is disproportionately poorer young people. Increasingly, research is showing us that governments that are elected by low turnout elections are less efficient. They're less effective when it comes to implementing policy, partly because they're less representative of the public will. So for our governments to be able to fix things like climate change, or to solve challenges like growth of populism, we need them to be able to implement policy effectively, and they find it harder to do that. And then, of course, if we've got fewer people voting, if we've got fewer people developing habits of participating in politics, we've got fewer agents of solidarity, bringing about positive change in their communities. So this is where my research comes in. Okay? It wasn't my intention to depress you all quite so much at the opening, but this is where my research comes in, all right? I want to know how we can fix this, and I'm particularly interested in to what extent volunteering can help fight this challenge. Can volunteering help get more young people from poorer backgrounds voting? Now, some of you in the room, I know, have actually already looked at this question. You'll have looked at research that's been done about it. I am not the first political scientist to ask the question. Actually, people have been asking this question and doing this research for about 70 years. And universally, or almost universally, they find that children who volunteer are more likely to vote. But there's a problem. Recently, what we have uncovered is that quite a lot of that research, and by that I mean virtually all of it, exaggerates the positive effects of volunteering, in some cases quite substantially. It's not their fault, there's a reason for it. Most people who volunteer in childhood do go on to vote when they reach adulthood. But is that because they volunteered, or is it because they were raised in a household, in an environment, by parents who make them likely to both volunteer when they're children and vote when they are adults? To elaborate, I'll try and put it another way, we want volunteering to have an effect on voting. We want to know whether children who volunteer become more likely to vote. But we know that there are other things that make you more likely to vote when you're to volunteer when you're a child and vote when you're an adult, such as a politicising experience in your childhood, such as a good political or civic education programme in schools, or just being raised by parents who volunteer themselves or are politically active. They encourage their kids to do the same. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is once you account for the influence of those things on how likely somebody is to volunteer when they're a child and vote when they're an adult, you find that there's no relationship between volunteering and voter turnout. And there was a really important study by Kim and Morgul in the US who basically looked at the effect of volunteering in childhood on voting once, I think they'd reached 21, the people in their sample. And what they found was that it's family background that matters. If you're raised in a, let's call it middle class, wealthier household with highly educated parents, chances are you'll volunteer and vote. There's no benefit from volunteering for the average child when you look at how likely they are to vote. But what I did with my research was ask the question, what if we look at the effect of volunteering specifically for those kids from the poorer households, the ones who aren't already likely to vote when they get older? Does volunteering do anything? And fortunately, for everybody who's looking really glum at the moment at the data I presented, the answer is yes. There is positive evidence here that volunteering helps compensate for children who are raised in poorer environments and the adverse effect that has on their chances of voting when they reach adulthood. Now, there's a whole host of research and statistics here which I promise I'm not going to bore you with. I'm just going to try and summarise the effect that volunteering has. In the UK, we've got this really powerful survey. It's called Understanding Society. They survey about 20,000 households every year, the same households, the same people, and they interview everybody in the house. So all the kids, all the parents, all the grandparents if they're in there. And it's been running since about 2010. Which means that we've got this wonderful data set where we've got a group of children as young as 11. We know how interested they were in politics. We asked them. We know whether they volunteered. We know whether they were protesting when they were kids. We know how politically engaged and highly educated and how wealthy their parents are. We can then see whether they volunteered when they were a bit older. And then, when they were old enough, we know whether they voted. So, what I've done is I've looked at the likelihood of those who volunteered voting in their first election for the last 3 general elections in the UK. And I divided them by whether or not they were raised by wealthier, politically engaged parents or poorer, politically disengaged parents. The key question here is just how likely are you to vote in the next election? On a scale from 0, meaning you won't, to 10, meaning you definitely will. If they volunteered in the year before, the kids who were raised by wealthy, politically engaged parents, their likelihood increased by 0.09, almost nothing. If they were raised by poorer, politically disengaged parents, though, it went up by 0.47. Now that comes across as a really small number in a scale of 0 to 10. But remember, I've accounted here for the effect of being raised by politically active parents. I'm accounting for their sex, I'm accounting for their age, I'm accounting for their education. And when you've done all that, a 0.5 increase on that 0 to 10 scale becomes meaningful. We're talking here about kids from the poorest backgrounds who become just that bit more likely to vote in their first election. And once you've got them at the first election, there's a really good chance you've got them at the next one as well. So you volunteering slightly, but significant, increases the likelihood of voting for young people from poorer backgrounds. I do have more evidence of this, if you like, from Switzerland as well. This isn't a UK-based phenomenon. I've written a Europe Talks paper, which isn't available yet, but it elaborates on this, and I'm happy to answer questions on it later. So, that's the good news, right? This is a big success for volunteering. I think it's great news, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Volunteering helps young people from the poorest, most politically deprived households become more likely to vote. The best evidence we have for why that happens, it makes young people more likely to be interested in politics. It raises their awareness of political issues. And that makes sense, right? If you volunteer in a homelessness shelter, you're going to become more aware about the effects of poverty or homelessness on people who suffer it. And that can motivate you to take an interest in politics. We also see that volunteering increases the belief that voting is a civic obligation, something we have a duty to do. In some cases, because of history, because our grandparents fought in wars to give us the right to vote. In some cases, it's out of an obligation to others, what we might call solidarity. We have a duty to vote to help others in our community. So volunteering can, in fact it is, now helping reduce generational turnout decline. It is helping young people from the poorest backgrounds become more likely to vote. My title of this presentation sadly included the word failures, because we can't ignore them, right? These are the bits we're not getting right. And there are 2 serious issues. The first one, for reasons we don't fully understand, is that the benefits of volunteering, at least as far as political participation are concerned, are greater for young men than young women. I will illustrate in a moment. The second one is one we are already very familiar with. Participation in volunteering programs of any kind is heavily skewed towards those from wealthier backgrounds and who are disproportionately likely to go into higher education. The kids who have the most to gain from volunteering are the least likely to do it. Volunteering benefits young men more than young women. I'm illustrating with the same data I showed you before. Okay, the data from the UK. How likely are these children to vote in their first general election if they volunteered in the year before, depending on whether they were raised by wealthier or poorer parents? So I'm just making sure that the drawing of me is sufficiently flattering so that people might believe I'm a millennial. I wasn't prepared. Young men, if they volunteered in the year before the election and they come from a wealthier household, their score, their likelihood of voting increased by 0.2. It matters, but it's small. But for young men from poorer households, it's 0.9. It's a 1 point increase. That's a big deal. But for young women, the difference is quite stark. It's a 0.3 increase for young women from poorer backgrounds. It's there, but it's small. And for young women from wealthier backgrounds, raised by politically engaged parents, these are the most likely to volunteer, by the way. They derive no benefit whatsoever in terms of how likely they were to vote in their first election as a result. We aren't sure why this is. In fact, I would love to hear your suggestions for why this is happening. My best guess, the theory, is that this reflects differences in the types of volunteering that young men and young women are likely to engage in. We know those differences exist. Okay, men of any age are more likely to volunteer for politically oriented organisations like political parties, trade unions, tenants and residents associations. Women are much more likely to volunteer for organisations relating to education, healthcare, children, religion. Maybe they don't provide the same benefits as the organisations that men tend to favour. But as I say, that is just a theory. Then we've got the socioeconomic bias in volunteering. This is from the 2020 European Social Survey. And what I've got is the proportion of people of 5 generations who volunteered broken down by education. If you're familiar with the education classification ISKED, the yellow bar is ISKED 5. Okay? For the rest of us, that means graduate level qualification. The blue bars are the guys with virtually no qualifications. For all the generations, volunteering is dominated by the yellow bars. These are the people who are highly educated, they're going to be wealthier when they're older, or in the case of the older generations, they're already likely to be wealthier. They're already going to be voting. It's the kids in the blue bars that we need to get volunteering. And I would say that there's some positive indication here in that the volunteering levels of Gen Z are slightly higher than that of the millennials, but that socioeconomic bias is still there. Despite the commendable efforts of many people in this room, of politicians, of volunteers all over Europe, this isn't going anywhere. We haven't done enough to get rid of this socioeconomic bias. So, the successes then of volunteering, the bit that we need to talk more about. Volunteering helps young people from the poorest backgrounds become more likely to vote in their first elections. These are the people who are currently the least likely to vote, the most underrepresented. Volunteering can help get them to the ballot box. Therefore, volunteering does have a critical role to play in reducing the generational inequalities in turnout and helping to promote European solidarity. Again, we can be proud of this. Volunteering in Europe is already having this effect. The failures, which we also need to talk about more, and where we need to work harder. The benefits of volunteering, again, I stress, at least as far as political participation is concerned, I don't know whether this extends to other areas, are much stronger for young men than young women. First thing we need to do is figure out why. We can't fix this if we can't explain it. But if my theory is right, that this reflects effectively gendered patterns in volunteering amongst young people, then we need to start thinking about how we can get more young women from poorer backgrounds into these politically productive forms of volunteering, because at the moment that's not where they are, and it looks like that's where they need to be. The other one is the persistent socioeconomic bias in volunteering, which has existed for about, well, as long as volunteering has existed, frankly. The participation of people from poorer households in volunteering schemes lags well behind that of their wealthier, more experienced elders. We still don't know how to overcome it, despite a heck of a lot of money and research and time being invested in it. How can we increase the participation of young people from poorer households in volunteering? What can we learn from existing policies and schemes that have been implemented? And we need to have difficult conversations. I have yet to meet a single person who thinks that mandating that young people volunteer is a good idea. But this is happening in Wales. We don't yet know whether or not it's had an effect. It tends to apply to the kids from the wealthier backgrounds, so maybe it will do nothing. But do we need to start mandating that young people volunteer? Do we need to start excluding young people from wealthier backgrounds and households from schemes like European Solidarity Corps? I'm expecting people to scream in horror at that suggestion, but how else are we going to make sure that volunteer opportunities disproportionately go to wealthier, richer kids who are going to vote anyway when they're older? How else can we make sure it gets to those who are becoming increasingly excluded from democratic politics? We need to have those difficult conversations. Thank you all very much for listening. I will engage in a bout of shameless self-promotion. If you have any questions, email me. I also have a newsletter. I use it to tell organisations like yours about my research and others in this area. Email me and I'll put you on the list. You can look out for my Europe Talks article, which will appear eventually, or you can just Google the title of the paper, or you can email me and I'll send it to you. But thank you all for your patience.
I can add one more thing. There is an option to ask a question right now. I think you were the first to.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you heard about this anthropological theory, why girls and boys are different. So when little girl is being born, she's being brought most likely normally by her mother, and in her brain develops certainty that yes, I'm gonna grow up, I'm gonna be like my mother. So I'm set. I don't have to search for the purpose of my life. When little boy is born, he knows that mother is the whole world. She provides for everything, she gives the security, and there is this terrible uncertainty. What am I gonna do? I'm never gonna be like my mom. I'm not a girl. So they look for the political and other organizations to find a goal. While the girls, they already said with what they have, they, especially from the lower income, they know that the future more likely is the family, so that's what they orientate. That's my comment.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. I have heard of it, and I've also looked. There are theories of political socialization, which basically say it's the way we raise girls and boys. We raise girls in a way that says, no, politics isn't for you. The home is for you. And we raise boys in a way that says, yes, politics is for you. Somebody disagrees with you, tell them to shut up. Go out and stand up for what you believe in. That's a caricature, I apologise, but. The theory, and there's a great deal of research showing that this helps fit into some of the divides that we see, say, with women for so long being less likely to vote than men. Whether that explains what's happening here, I don't know. It's a fascinating thought, it's a fascinating theory. Maybe it explains what's happened. My phone buzzed while you were asking the question. I suspect it's my mum. She's right. Yes, that's exactly it. I don't know. I will look into it. But the data doesn't exist, so it's an idea I need to take away and then try and persuade someone to give me £1 million. So I think it's a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I do have a question and a comment. So I wanted to know, why do you think that the wealthier people having like a higher portion in the volunteering is a negative thing, although it means that they are having more sympathy for the society, awareness of their roles, and that they're giving back to the society and to the poor people. And also, I disagree with like eliminating them from, programs like the European Solidarity Corps and stuff like that, because this means it will have a negative impact on the graduate participation in the election and in the civic participation. But we need to focus more on how to integrate the poor into these programs and not eliminate the wealthier people.
Thank you very much. I actually agree with both of the sentiments that you expressed. I don't actually think we need to start stopping kids from wealthier backgrounds take part in European Solidarity Corps. I don't think that would solve the problem. I used it as an example of the kind of unpopular ideas we do need to start thinking about if we're serious about getting more kids from poorer backgrounds involved with volunteering. I'm not convinced that we need to start excluding those who want to volunteer, who want to express their solidarity. We don't need to be excluding those. But we need to start thinking about things that so far haven't been considered, so far haven't been taken seriously, and which are going to be divisive, that the chances are not everyone in this room would agree with, if we're going to fix a problem that has plagued volunteering programs since the 1940s. We haven't figured it out. We don't know how to fix it. I don't think that graduates participating in volunteering is a bad thing, not least because volunteers give a great many benefits to the people who are the beneficiaries of their volunteering. So I certainly don't advocate that we reduce volunteering amongst wealthy people, and I don't think it's negative that those kids are doing it. The purpose, or the point I'm driving at in my presentation, is that we have a problem at the moment in that insofar as volunteering benefits young people from the perspective of helping them participate in politics, it doesn't really help the kids from the wealthier backgrounds because they're already being socialised in an environment that helps them participate. Like their parents are wealthy, their parents are active, their parents are probably volunteers. The problem we have is that the kids who stand to gain the most are the ones who are least likely to volunteer. It's not about wealthier kids volunteering being a problem, so much as volunteering being dominated by kids from wealthier backgrounds. One way of fixing it might be to broaden volunteering opportunities, to give more money to European Solidarity Corps so there's more space for these things, or localised volunteering schemes. But we've tried that before and it didn't work either. So the point is to try and get us thinking about things that aren't going to be popular and that we haven't tried before. But I don't want anyone to take away from this that I think that volunteers from wealthier backgrounds, or indeed many of you in the room who will be volunteering, it's a bad thing depending on where you came from. It's not. It's not. It's about getting the benefits of volunteering where they need to go.
Also, big thanks from me. Really data-based presentation. I would, if possible, if it's available, dig a little bit more in data as you presented. My question would be, is there results, or can you tell if those poor men from young men from poorer backgrounds if they go to vote, is their behavior same as their parents or grandparents, or are they voting differently?
Oh, you mean in terms of who they vote for?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, for the most part it's not. But the extent to which their voting behaviour differs from their parents varies across different countries. So in Europe at the moment, for instance, one of the things that we know is happening that is talked about at length is the growing support for populist political parties and right-leaning populist political parties amongst young people in France and Germany, for example. In Britain, that's not really happening. It's left-wing political populist parties that are popular amongst younger people in Britain. Younger people today aren't necessarily echoing the voting habits of their parents. That bond, it used to happen quite a lot, but that bond is weakening. Young people today are becoming more, the word I guess is volatile, more unpredictable in terms of who they're going to vote for and how they're going to vote. And therefore we don't necessarily see congruence between how they vote and who their parents are voting for. There are similarities. You know, if you've got a kid from a poor background whose parents are also from a poor background, at the moment in Britain these people are more likely to vote for right populist parties. But what we also see is younger people, on the whole, more likely to vote for left populist parties in Britain, regardless of their background. It's just the way British politics has evolved. That same thing hasn't yet happened or isn't happening in Germany. There's something different in Germany and France and so on. So they don't necessarily match the voting patterns of their parents, which in some ways is great, in some ways it brings other problems.
Thank you. I do have this bad role on timing. I know. But
you can skip that minute from unprecedented COVID.
Showing solidarity already.
two things. One, I know, Birgit, that you have to leave, so I'll give you a last question. And another announcement, we are super happy that you're going to be here tomorrow too. So again, use someone's brain. Use Stuart's brain. He will also be here tomorrow for the Solidarity Lab to also deepen a bit the discussion. So there's more space on that. One last question.
Thank you. It's more a comment actually, because sort of it's a very, there were many interesting points in your presentation, and this idea is really thought-provoking and very controversial about should we look at the income of parents to decide if a person is allowed to enter a European Union mobility scheme. But there are pros and cons, and the discussion is just not very evolved yet. But I'm sure talking about money during the next few years we'll have to face difficult discussions like this one. But as we are talking about money, one comment to what you presented. I know a lot of young people from well-off backgrounds. You are right, what most of them are doing is they volunteer somewhere. I also know quite a number of young people living in poverty or in a low-income family. You know what all of them do? Sell their jobs. So if we talk about time restrictions and the need to earn money, then volunteering per se is probably not cut out for the needs of people living on a budget. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, I mean, it's absolutely right. It's one of the difficult conversations we have about volunteering, isn't it? That younger people from poorer backgrounds, it's not that they're lazy. It's that they need to help pay to keep the roof over the family. They need to put food on the table. If they're young adults who have got children, their budget is stretched so tight that, frankly, someone like me is never going to appreciate how difficult it would be. But I can make an educated guess that looking for an opportunity to give up your time for free is not going to be something that's going to be high on their list of agenda. They can't afford it. So, yeah, in one way, this is how volunteering is. It's very difficult to see how we can use volunteering to help connect those people with electoral politics. unless we basically pay them to volunteer, or we give them more social support or welfare support so that they have the time to volunteer. That could be one of the most effective welfare interventions of the last century, by the way. If they did it, you're never going to find a government willing to do it in the current climate. But I think it's a fantastic point to raise, and it's something that we need to be thinking about. Forgive me, you made another comment, which I really wanted to say something about, and I've forgotten it. What was the first comment that you said, Bridget? I'm so sorry.
Checking families' incomes.
Checking families' income. Thank you very much. Yes, yes. This is something for politicians. That when you've got a politician with a limited budget, and before I was an academic, I was a councillor for a few years, and I had this conversation. Somebody came to me and said, we need more money for a volunteering scheme for kids in one of the wards that I represented. The first thing you ask is how many people are involved. The common way that politicians have of judging the success of a scheme like volunteering, Erasmus, European Solidarity Corps, how many people have you got out there? How many people have you got working in these communities? It's not the wrong question, but if this data is showing anything, it's that it's about more than the numbers. It's about who's taking part in these things. Whether we need to go down the route of vetting people on the basis of family income, that's exactly the kind of thinking that we need. I don't know whether it would work. I doubt it would command public support. Maybe European Solidarity Corps would collapse if we were to start doing that. There's a lot of moving parts, but these are the kind of ideas I really think we need to be considering. I think it's a brilliant suggestion, if only to kick off a conversation for how we might achieve this stuff.
Thank you. A lot of food for thought, I can see.